Kia ora. A lot of people feel like politicians are all worthy of contempt, that there is no such thing as an honest politician, that they're all effectively the same and voting is pretty much pointless. The problem with this kind of thinking is that it's an easy, almost lazy form of judgment, a dismissal of all politicians as equally blameworthy. As accurate as it may or may not be, seeing politicians as undifferentiated and not existing on a spectrum of corruption means that we empower those who consistently vote. If the people who feel disenchanted with the system would vote more, well then that would shift the establishment politics. So there is a lot of disenchantment. There's been a sense for a long time, a sense of disquiet, without really knowing how to name the problem. There was this false consensus of neoliberalism around the world that had left people feeling like there's no point, that both sides are the same. But as time has passed, the sense of false stillness and paralysis has begun to be replaced by a sense of what the problem actually is. Now that we can name it, this process of identifying the problem is one of the first steps towards addressing it and finding a new reason for hope and positivity. The problem of neoliberalism itself, the fact that there is this false consensus, the problems of inequality and also the environment, these are the kind of thing that can unite a generation around a certain cause. And there's been studies of whether the United States, for instance, constitutes an oligarchy or a democracy, and the conclusion was that it's an oligarchy, that the interests of the most powerful almost always trump the interests of mass movements, of public interest groups, and the people in general, those who lack as much political clout, which makes sense, but it does show that there are certain issues which, when an entire population or the majority of a population can unite around a single coherent issue, that they can in fact defeat the masses. And this happens perhaps once in a generation or even less. It may have happened, say, once in the 20th century, and then earlier, say, the issue of slavery showed one possibility, one instance of the masses or those who were against a cause that served the powerful managed to defeat it. And there have been various other examples, but we're not going to go into detail on that. The point is just that once we have an issue that we can coalesce around, this enables the masses, that empowers them. Perhaps this all seems trivial and obvious, but to me it means that there's a reason for a renewed hope. And I think that the possibility of hope and the change in direction towards positivity and hope away from threat perception, which seems to be the main problem now. If you look at the division in our society, the things that people are saying about everybody else, the problems that they're identifying are other people. And if you look at those people that they identify a problem with, those people are also experiencing elevated threat perception, feeling like they're under attack. So if we can calm everyone down, that'd be great. If we could, decrease this division and extremism. But they're a symptom of an underlying problem. They're something that happens during certain historical eras when the consensus has disappeared. And that's a positive indicator. It's just something that needs to be resolved. To just try and calm everyone down is almost fruitless in a way. To try and just speak rationally to extremists and say, hey, things are all good, just chill, or to tell them that they're factually incorrect. That's a conspiracy theory, you're confabulating things, you're speculating, there's no justification for it. They don't want to hear that because they're not thinking from I'm going to consider the facts. They're thinking of a just in case. We could say, it's irrational to think like this, but it's not irrational to apply strategies that don't stand rational justification in and of themselves. And as an enclosed logical argument, something may fail, but in certain circumstances, it may be right to be biased towards certain things. If there are threats around, the problem is that they're not, and the threats aren't there, but these people are just demonstrating excessive caution. So there's this idea that, say, for instance, to pursue happiness directly is something that we're unable to achieve happiness by pursuing it directly. That it's a fool's errand, and that a much more productive route is to search for purpose. When you're doing something meaningful, that's when you can derive happiness from this, a sense of justifiable satisfaction. And I think the same applies with this fear and this threat perception that is going on throughout our society, that trying to just alleviate the threat perception, be like, hey, calm down, that doesn't help. We have to go for something beyond it, to provide people with something which they are going to respond to differently, where they're not going to perceive it as a threat. So that's where hope comes in. And for a long time it's been rational to say that there is no reason for hope. It has seemed, at least, like that's the case. There's a lot of sense of despair, and this is tied into the thing that I was saying about the idea that, there's no point voting, for instance, that all parties are equally the same and that evil always triumph. it's the reason why this was justified and why it actually turns out to be positive, even though now it turns out to be incorrect and to be a hindrance, is that it was a justifiable response to the system, a motivation to come up with a clear analysis of it. And that's become fully realized and then has been exaggerated and overextended beyond its justification by extremists. So the full realization is the idea that the system is corrupt, and there are problems with the established ideologies of, say, capitalism and communism. Absolutely, that these were both authoritarian and examples of people trying to impose certain ideals on us, and the skepticism towards established norms and the nihilism that would come through in the 20th century. These are all responses that were justified, and this process motivated a bunch of substantive critiques. And then when it extends into conspiracy theory and just blanket despair and more nihilism, a response to nihilism of just like sort of apathy and paralysis, that's when it goes too far, because what we're coming into is a post-nihilistic age. What we need is something new, a new positive claim to believe in, as opposed to dispelling all the old false positive claims. So we've done that, and now we need the new positive claim. And the positive claim is just the same like what happened with Christianity. The benefit of it was that Jesus said he was bringing good news. The idea of good news for everybody at a societal level doesn't have to be a religious thing, but it can function the way that religion does for a society. People talk about having a God-shaped hole in our soul, or where our heart is, and needing something like that. We don't necessarily need theism as a rational belief, as a belief constructed with certain truth values applied to certain statements. I believe that a God defined by condition set X has the existential quantifier of, like, yes, it does exist in some immaterial sense. This is not the way that religion or spirituality should necessarily function. I'm not saying it's a problem, but what they're doing there is actually philosophy, a kind of weird intellectual exercise around certain rigid constructions, rigid definitions of religious experiences or phenomena, which may or may not best be represented by concepts or best represented at all. Perhaps they're best experienced. And so these can be mystical things that can't be rationally stated. So if there is some kind of religious truth out there, it's not necessarily worth engaging with sort of logically, rigorously structured logical arguments and established rigid concepts, the kind of precise definitions that we need to conduct philosophy effectively, and definitive truth values. I don't think that these are necessarily useful when discussing those concepts. So there's something sort of beyond yes and no about religious questions, but there's also a benefit. Our societies have historically been structured around religions, or at least around sort of spiritual, supernatural kind of beliefs. And it doesn't have to be supernatural, it doesn't have to be theistic, but a kind of unifying belief, a unifying purpose, that's something that can bring us forward. And I think the idea of kaitiakitanga, thinking of it as guardianship for the environment, that's probably the most rational belief system. You can have religion that can be polytheistic, it can be tribalist, then you can have the universal gods. Things become more general, more abstract, and more justifiable. Then you can get the God out of it and have humanism, so you're focusing on the entire species, but then there's still one species. How is that not just extended selfishness? And a true value set beyond that is environmentalism, which also is in concord with the scientific, metaphysical, naturalist kind of worldview that we have now. The worldview of the scientist is deeply compatible with the imperatives of ecology. People say that you can't get values from science. You can't get from an is to an ought, that kind of thing. And that it's the job of philosophy and science can't answer these kind of questions. That's not necessarily true. Science brings with it certain established ought statements that has the value of knowledge and stuff. The scientific method values knowledge, and from that we can have the value of the environment as the greatest source of complexity and knowledge that we imitate and we study and we analyze. It's the input that we need for our scientific system. It's a necessary component for it. So a sense of kaitiakitanga, of guardianship for the environment, is a justifiable, perhaps the most justifiable, the most rationally well-established ideology that we could come up with. And from this we get the sense of purpose, and also it can become mystical. It can be this thing that we have a sense of wonder for. So we shouldn't despair about the condition that we find ourselves in with respect to the environment. These are problems that we can solve. It's just that we need this unified action. We need massive increased say, state expenditure, especially on things like basic research. It has to be the kind of effort that we exerted during wartime or the space race, except now it being a united global effort rather than being individual states competing destructively with each other. And this is possible. The fact that scientific progress has slowed since the space race, that we've had this process kind of stall, is because of the lack of funding in basic research and the turn away towards market solutions, which favors short-term thinking. That's not a problem. This is something that has to be disavowed without necessarily delegitimizing or destroying the credibility of established political parties, because these are the vehicles that we can use to make change as established political parties. So if you have, for instance, the Labour Party in New Zealand, it has to repudiate neoliberalism, but it has to do this in a way that protects its own reputation. We as a society, perhaps we should say that it was evil, but we can also say things like it was a failed experiment, not necessarily even failed, that it has run its course, that we did have overactive and irrational state behavior, and we had to curb it by returning to market forces. We reaped the benefits that we could from it. Now it has run its course, and it is overdue for a change. The time has come for a definitive change in a new direction. So this is a way that we can, instead of repudiating ourselves as a society, we can say, we've done this and now it's time to go in a new direction, and that's of increased state spending, increased basic research. So it's not there's a hindrance that we have been experiencing, but that is not a cause for despair. It's in fact an opportunity. The fact that we haven't put this effort in shows what's available to us. There are certain things that are just around the corner, like fusion energy, massive space exploration, exploitation of resources in space, and clean energy, and automation and artificial intelligence. These things, we can really ramp them up if we put in that same kind of effort that we did when we were united as a society around certain issues, like, for instance, in wartime. But if we do that on a global scale, there's definite reason not just for hope, but for a sense of wonder. And the sense of wonder ties into the idea of environmentalism as an ideology as well, because it can provide some of the benefits, almost in a spiritual, mystical sense, the sense of a wonder that you can get from the environment, from the natural world, from the study and understanding of what exists independent of the mind. So this includes formal truths like the theorems of mathematics and our understanding of philosophy. These things, I disputed the efficacy of philosophy with respect to religious questions, but that doesn't mean that I find it worthless. In fact, I think it's of fundamental value, and it's another thing that we can appreciate. We have the natural world and the world that is given to us, and then there's also the internal world, which is imposed upon us as well. It's not just created; it's given to us effectively almost as a gift. It's not luck, though. It's inherently necessary that something like this would exist, that there's this pairing between consciousness and that which it is conscious of the consideration of information and the information that's there to be considered. There's the superset of the natural world and of the formal truths, which together are the object of our subjective experience, and it's this pairing between them which can produce this great sense of wonder. So the unknown and the unfulfilled, the world of possibilities that we face, is